ropes quivered as the vessel ascended. The wind waited in the distance, flowing about the tiny boat as it rose quietly, shielded by the vast face of black rock which sailed past its port side. The pilot steadied himself against the gunwale and gripped ever more tightly to the rigging which shot past his face. He pulled himself round to examine the small set of delicate brass instruments that lay embedded next to the carved wheel. The temperature was dropping. He didn't need to peer through the thermometer's glass face to know. His breath had slowly begun to materialize, thickening the clouds about him. A hefty wobble shook the craft and slowed its progress ever so slightly. The pilot stared up at the great cavernous interior of the fabric above him. Leaning forwards, he gave a heavy tug on the handle which hung nearby, sending a column of flame roaring up towards the peak of the balloon. The ship began to rise more steadily, taking the pilot's heartbeat with it. He checked the dials again, already a personal record in altitude. He studied the broken rock face beside him as it soared past, deciding to pull the ship a little further out from its embrace with a nudge of the wheel. The mountain protected them from the barren force of the wind, but if the balloon rode too closely to their protector, then there would be little left for the pilot to do. The world turned an eerie shade of blue as the pilot's goggles descended over his face. He moved steadily towards the opposite side of the craft and leant carefully over the edge, peering coldly past the outskirts of the airship's balloon to look up into the sky he was aiming for. The air looked relatively clear until it was broken sharply by a hard grey wall, which marked the absence of the mountain's presence. If the temperature within the grey monolith could be accurately recorded, he was told the weather below could be predicted, provided he returned with a number. The peak of the cliff came within sight. The pilot fizzed with energy as the cloudy void approached him. He scuttled about the little deck, a frenzy of motion as he endeavoured to ensure all was tied down. Each of the ship's side sails were drawn in, and the anchor was sat ready to drop. Satisfied with the condition of his ship, the pilot returned to the helm where he carefully tethered himself to the hefty wooden wheel and fixed his eyes on the two dials in front of him, his hand ready at the anchor's release. He waited silently for a moment as the ship took the final few steps of its climb, swaying slightly as the wind clamoured around the thinning rock face. He began to hear it, the roar, the deafening wails and screams of the wind whipping over the mountain's peak with all the ferocity of a beast free of its leash. He dropped the anchor, feeling the weight of it tug the boat to sit slightly lopsided. He listened carefully to the heavy scraping of the anchor against the rock, waiting for it to catch before, in an instant, the sound disappeared, and the balloon veered to the ship's right as the side of the hull broke clear of the Guardian's peak. The pilot emerged into nothing. For a few achingly long moments he floated without space or dimension, the disorientation brought on by the immense cloud's grey mass, transporting him to a world unrecognisable to the tiny being in his balloon. The sound was near all-encompassing. The wind's guttural shriek cut through him and pounded around the interior of his head as great waves of spray shot over the boat's side. The deck had already begun to crystallise, as the ship swung in a desperate arc about the whirling mass of the clouds, skating over the drifts of cloud, gaining no ground where no edge or centre could be discovered. It was pure force, and it had him. Before a great hand stretched out through the fog and threw the pilot to the icy deck with an awesome jerk, informing him that the anchor had finally caught. The tethered form of the ship swung violently as the pilot pulled himself back towards the helm. He dragged his face up towards the controls where the spinning faces of the dials greeted him fondly. The pilot gasped as he noticed they had far exceeded their required altitude. With no way to recall the temperature in the belly of the gale, the pilot reached out a stiff-gloved hand and hammered the face of the thermometer, smashing the glass beneath him and fixing the dial in place. As the ship twirled and the wind's chorus sung with a vicious joy, the pilot reached towards the last switch on the boat's controls. With a jolt, he felt the balloon release. It disappeared in an instant, fed to the hungry gale that flowed about him, now streaming past the sides of the ship as it had begun to fall. He clung to the helm as the grey clouds surged upwards, his body desperately attempting to float up towards them. He was unaware of how long they fell. He simply clung with his eyes screwed closed, as the deafening course of the clouds bellowed its displeasure. But eventually the clouds gave in, and the little craft was released, continuing its fall in a burning silence before the jerking start of a great unravelling of cloth spun the boat into a gentle glide once again. The pilot opened his eyes, cracking the goggles from his face as he sat up against the ship's helm, staring about him at the pale white scene of his jagged and icy boat. The shining crystals had already begun to melt away as a beam of sunlight shone over the deck, and the pilot laid his aching head against the ship's side, a small smile breaking over his wind-beaten face, as a faint gust of wind whistled over his cheek.